This is the Waupac Area Public Library's Lunch and Learn.
Well, today's speaker is Campbell. I know most of you are familiar with him. He has spoken before, and it was my privilege to meet him today, and welcome.
Okay. We've now created a variety of 12 different history stories. And now I'd like to share one of these moments with you entitled The Story of Charles Lindbergh's Path to Glory. When Charles Lindbergh set out on his solo transatlantic flight in May 1927, it signaled the beginning of one of aviation's most exciting episodes. But the 25-year-old pilot had already gained a wealth of experience as a wing walker, barnstormer, and airmail pilot before he set off from New York to Paris, France. Born on February 4, 1902, in Detroit, Michigan, he was the only child of Charles and Evangeline Lindbergh. Young Charles's early years were spent on a farm near Little Falls, Minnesota. His father was a lawyer who later represented his Minnesota's 6th district as a U.S. congressman. The family moved numerous times. From his father, Charles inherited a dimpled chin and perpetually tousled hair. From his mother, dreaminess, and from both, a tendency to be headstrong. Young Charles, he was never Charlie or anything more relaxed and familiar, grew up in a household that was comfortable and well looked after, as the family had 3 servants, but lacking in warmth. Both his parents were almost wholly incapable of showing affection. He and his mother never hugged. At bedtime, they shook hands. And as both boy and man, Charles signed letters to his father, sincerely, C.A. Lindbergh, as if corresponding with his bank manager. Charles was a shy boy. He made so little impression on Little Falls that when journalists descended on the town in 1927, looking for anecdotes from his boyhood, none of his ex-schoolmates could think of any. Lindbergh himself, in adulthood, said that he had few memories of his daily life as a youngster. In his first autobiographical book effort called We, copy of which I have over to my right on my resource table, he gave just 18 lines to his childhood. In 1906, when Charles was 5, his father, pictured here, was elected to Congress. This meant that Charles divided his time between Little Falls, which he loved, and Washington, D.C., which he did not. This gave him an eventful but disrupted childhood. He enjoyed experiences that other children could only dream of. He played on the grounds of the White House and in the halls of the Capitol, visited the Panama Canal at the age of 11 with his mother, went to school with the sons of Theodore Roosevelt. But he moved around so much that he never really became part of anything. His major interests developed along mechanical and scientific lines. Charles attended 11 different schools before graduating from high school, and he distinguished himself at each of them by his mediocrity. In the autumn of 1920, Lindbergh entered the University of Wisconsin, hoping to become an engineer. He survived in large part by having his mother, who moved to Madison, Wisconsin with him, write his papers for him. But ultimately, even that wasn't enough. Halfway through his sophomore year, he was dropped from the University of Wisconsin at Madison for reasons shown here in a letter to his mother. and abruptly announced his intention to become an aviator. From his parents' perspective, this was a mortifying ambition. Flying was poorly paid, wildly unsafe, and unreliable as a career. And nowhere was those qualities more evident than in the United States. In no important area of technology has America ever fallen further behind the rest of the world than it did with aviation in the 1920s. Europe had its first airline in 1919. By 1927, France had 9 airlines operating. British Airlines were flying almost 1 million miles a year, and Germany was safely delivering 151,000 passengers to their destinations. In America, in early 1927, the number of scheduled passenger air services was none. Without airlines to employ them, American aviators had to turn a hand to whatever work they could find, like barnstorming, such as thrilling spectators with wing-walking stunts and air acrobatics, parachuting out of airplanes, dusting crops, giving rides at county fairs, dragging advertising banners across the skies, and above all, carrying mail in planes like this de Havilland biplane, the one area in which America was preeminent. But delivering mail was dangerous. 31 of the first 40 airmail pilots were killed in crashes, and accidents remained common throughout the 1920s. Airmail pilots flew in all kinds of weather and often at night, but with almost no support in the way of navigational aids. Many times they had to search for a town and hope that someone had written its name on the roof of a building. Such deficiencies marked almost every area of American civil aviation. Until 1924, Detroit had no airfield at all. In 1927, San Francisco and Baltimore still didn't. St. Louis had 1. New York had 4 small airfields with basic facilities. None of them even had a control tower. No American airfield did. Not until 1925 did America begin at last to address its aeronautical shortcomings. In May 1926, the Air Commerce Act was signed into law by President Calvin Coolidge, which brought in some minimal training requirements for pilots and inspection of planes used in interstate commerce. This was the casual and high-risk world in which Charles Lindbergh learned to fly. In 1922, he motorcycled to Lincoln, Nebraska, and enrolled as a student at the Nebraska Aircraft Company, where he had his first flight in a Lincoln Standard biplane on April 9, 1922, at the age of 20. There was no ground school, so he learned what he could from the factory workers. His flying instructor, Ira Biffle, was about to let him solo after 8 hours, but the company required a student to furnish a bond to cover any damage to the aircraft, and Lindbergh could not afford it. His friend Herod Ball was planning a barnstorming trip through Nebraska, and Lindbergh went with him on a brief but perilous career as a stunt performer. Within a week, he was wing walking, and within a month, he was without any prior training, parachuting from giddy heights to the delight of watching crowds below. And in the course of these duties, he also learned in an entirely informal way to fly. He proved to be unusually good at it. In April 1923, Lindbergh bought a surplus Curtiss JN-4 Jenny for $500. He received 30 minutes of dual instruction, and then he soloed in it. He decided to barnstorm alone. Barnstorming gave him a great deal of practical experience as he made many flights, but no technical training. In March of 1924, he corrected that deficiency by enlisting as an aviation cadet in the U.S. Army Flight Training Program at Brooks and Kelly Fields in San Antonio, Texas, which provided the most advanced and challenging training then available. He finished at the top of his class, the first time in his life he had done anything well in academics, and emerged with the rank of second lieutenant. Out of a class of 104, only Lindbergh and 17 others received their wings in March 1925. There was no military post assignments available at that time, so he took a job as an airmail pilot, flying the route between St. Louis and Chicago in late 1925 through September 1926, where he acquired the sort of resourcefulness that comes with flying cheap and temperamental planes through every possible type of adversity. Flying in fog and at night resulted in many accidents for airmail pilots. These hazardous conditions for Lindbergh resulted in 2 emergency parachute jumps in 1926, adding to 2 earlier jumps in 1925. And at that point, he was the first pilot in history to have made 4 successful parachute jumps out of an airplane. Shortly after that last episode in September 1926, Lindbergh began to think seriously about a New York to Paris flight, motivated by the offer of French-born Raymond Ortigue, who owned hotels in both cities. On May 22, 1919, Ortigue had offered $25,000 to, quote, the first aviator who shall cross the Atlantic in land or water aircraft heavier than air from Paris to New York or from New York to Paris without stop, unquote. The prize went unclaimed for 7 years, while no transatlantic flights were made that conformed to the prize requirement. Even though an estimated 117 people traveled by air across the Atlantic, most as passengers, before 1927. But by 1926, several European and American pilots were planning to compete for the Ortigue Prize. The first to try flying eastbound from America was World War I French flying ace René Funk, with a crew of 3 in a Sikorsky S-35 biplane that crashed on takeoff from Roosevelt Field, Long Island on September 21, 1926, and 2 of his crew members were killed. Next, Noel Davis and Stanton Wooster became the first Americans to announce their intentions to fly from New York to Paris. Their plane was a trimotor. Then Richard Byrd declared that he was going to make the flight in a Fokker trimotor. Clarence Chamberlain and Charles Levine announced that they were going to fly a single-engine Wright Bellanca, pictured here. French flyers planning to fly westbound from France included Charles Nungesser and Francisco Colli. Here's a copy of Lindbergh's entry form for the prize dated February 26, 1927. The more Lindbergh thought about how aircraft had improved since World War I, the more possible the flight seemed to him. Several facts soon became outstanding, he later recalled. The foremost was the development of a reliable, lightweight, air-cooled engine and lightened aircraft construction. It would not only be possible to reach Paris, but under normal conditions, to land with a large reserve of fuel and have a high factor of safety, Lindbergh felt. In many ways, Charles Lindbergh's greatest achievement was not flying the Atlantic in 1927, but getting a plane with which to fly the Atlantic. Somehow he managed to persuade 8 businessmen in St. Louis to back him, convincing them that a plane with St. Louis in its title could do nothing but good for the city's business prospects. And by late autumn 1926, Lindbergh had a promise of $13,000 of funding from his backers, plus $2,000 of his own, which he hoped would be enough to get him a single-engine plane capable of crossing an ocean. On February 3, 1927, the backers sent a cable to a small company in San Diego, California, the Ryan Flying Company, asking it if it could build a plane for an Atlantic flight, and if so, how much would it cost, and how long would it take them? The reply came quickly, saying Ryan could build the plane in 60 days for $6,000 plus expense of the engine, which it would install at cost. An order was placed on February 28, 1927, for a plane equipped with a Wright Whirlwind engine costing about $4,000. For the next 2 months, Lindbergh and the chief Ryan engineer Donald Hall worked closely with the entire Ryan workforce on the airplane. Hall was surprised that Lindbergh was going to fly alone, but it made the designing easier. There would be no radios or night flying equipment, and to provide a structure capable of handling the weight of extra fuel on takeoff, an extended wing and wide-wheel tread landing gear were designed. Lindbergh wanted the cockpit placed in the aft position behind the main fuselage gas tanks. That restricted forward visibility, but he did not see any great disadvantage to that, as there was a window on both sides of the cockpit seat. And there would probably be no one to run into out over the Atlantic Ocean in May of 1927. Even so, one of Ryan mechanics, Charlie Randolph, installed a special retractable periscope in the upper left-hand corner of the instrument panel that Lindbergh could use if he needed to look forward. Much of what the Ryan workers did was based on improvisation and guesswork. Realizing they had no idea how far it was from New York to Paris by the Great Circle route, they went to the local library and carefully measured the distance on a large globe with a piece of string. And by such means, one of history's greatest airplanes was built. Also, since Lindbergh would be flying this Great Circle route over the ocean without landmarks, he spent hours plotting the track he would follow on a variety of Mercator charts, guided by his magnetic and earth inductor compasses in the cockpit. From New York to Paris, Lindbergh worked out a Great Circle route, changing course as he projected it on what he called takes of 100 miles apiece, as shown on this slide. As the plane was taking shape, Lindbergh argued for severe austerity in the aircraft's design. No radios, no gas gauges, no navigation lights, and no creature comforts. He chose to replace the weight of a co-pilot with extra fuel, and this gave him about 300 miles additional range in the fuel tanks. Although the total distance was 3,600 miles, the water gap between Newfoundland and Ireland was only about 1,850 miles. And under normal conditions, he felt he could arrive on the coast of Europe, possibly over 300 miles off course, and still have enough fuel remaining to reach Paris. The completed Spirit of St. Louis, as has often been said, was little more than a flying gas tank. It carried 300 gallons of fuel in its two forward and center fuselage tanks, and 150 gallons in three wing tanks, for a total of 450 gallons. Times 6 pounds per gallon, that equaled a little over 2,700 pounds of fuel on board the airplane. These tanks were all controlled manually by an elaborate set of 14 small valves below the instrument panel, shown here. By using a set of petcocks, Lincoln could select which fuel tank he wanted to use. The instrument panel was just had 10 fairly rudimentary gauges. The construction of the plane consisted of wood and metal components, steel tube framing, and cotton fabric skin treated with cellulose and painted aluminum. In the cockpit, Lincoln selected a wicker chair for himself, the built-in discomfort of the seat being viewed as an asset to help him stay awake, and also weighed less than a leather seat would have weighed. The plane also had no brakes, and that would not matter in most circumstances, but it would prove an unnerving absence when later crowds streamed onto runways wherever Lindbergh landed. There would be no parachute, and for food he equipped himself with 5 ham and chicken sandwiches and 1 quart of water. And he also added a life raft in case he had to ditch. To maximize mileage, every ounce of excess weight was discarded. Lindbergh took nothing he didn't feel he needed. He reportedly refused an offer of $1,000 from a stamp collector to carry 1 pound of mail to Paris in the Spirit of St. Louis. He chose not to compromise on his principles of excess weight and said no. Meanwhile, while the Spirit was nearing completion and being removed from the upper story of the Ryan plant for assembly on the ground shown here, the newspapers carried stories about other competitors on their New York to Paris project. Clarence Chamberlain and Bert Acosta in the Columbia had set a local nonstop endurance flight record of 51 hours on April 14. Such a demonstration indicated that they were ready for a transatlantic flight. Bird's plane, the America, had a test flight accident on April 18, but he felt he would be ready for a May flight. And Nungesay stated he would leave France on April 24. On April 26, Davis and Wooster, on the last of their test flights, were killed on takeoff from Langley Field, Virginia. Well, that left Byrd, whose plane was being repaired, and Chamberlain still in the running, although Chamberlain had a takeoff accident on April 24. On April 28, 1927, just 2 months after the order was placed for the Spirit, Lindbergh made his first test flight from Dutch Flats in San Diego, California. and was pleased with the speed and agility of the aircraft. Over the next 10 days, he took the plane up another 22 times, mostly in short test flights of 5 to 20 minutes each, gradually increasing the fuel load from 38 gallons to 300. His greatest concern was weight. Here's a picture of the Ryan factory employees who helped build his plane, gathered in front of the newly built Spirit of St. Louis. On its completion on April 28th, the Spirit weighed in at 2,150 pounds empty. It was powered by a 223 air-cooled 9-cylinder Wright J-5C whirlwind engine shown here. That was estimated to be able to perform flawlessly for over 9,000 hours. An amazing evidence of Lindbergh's frugality was that his total expenses, airplane, fuel, food, lodging, everything, came to just $13,500. On May 8, news broke that Nungesay and Coley left Paris, the first plane to take to the air in the competition since René Fonck back in 1926. It appeared as if all of Lindbergh's and Ryan Airlines' efforts had been in vain. Newspapers reported their expected progress, but then Nungesay and Coley vanished and were never found and seen again. Lindbergh's chance for glory was still within reach. Now only Chamberlain and Levine were left as the most promising competitor, although Byrd was still hedging about his intended takeoff date. Lindbergh left San Diego on the afternoon of May 10 for St. Louis, and reaching St. Louis in early morning, he landed at Lambert Field 14 hours and 25 minutes after takeoff. The next morning, he departed Lambert and arrived at Curtis Field, Long Island, 7 hours and 20 minutes later. The total flying time of 21 hours and 45 minutes from California to New York was an unofficial record for a coast-to-coast flight at that time. Landing his sleek Spirit of St. Louis at Curtis Airfield on May 12, Lindbergh sparked a new wave of public interest in the New York to Paris race. Radio and press coverage began to focus on Lindbergh as a serious contender for the Orteig Prize, no longer a, quote, flying fool, unquote, or merely a footnote in the news coverage. Headlines appeared across the nation with breathless commentary on the unfolding drama on Long Island. Already, 6 men had died in the race. The next few days, Lindbergh spent working with engine and instrument experts and checking nearby Roosevelt Field, which was longer and seemed safer than Curtis Field for the proposed takeoff. That same week, Lindbergh's mother, Evangeline, arrived from Detroit to see her son on the eve of his historic flight. The press hounded her without mercy, asking her probing questions about her state of mind and her awareness of the dangers facing her son. And if you recall in the earlier part of my presentation about the comment they never hugged when he was a boy, the press tried to get them to put their arms around each other and look at each other. No way would they do that. And this is the picture they came up with on Lindbergh's flight with his mom just before he took off. Lindbergh planned to take off for Paris as soon as the weather conditions were favorable. But bad weather delayed him for more than a week. And on the morning of May 19, reports reached him that the long-awaited clearing over the North Atlantic was underway, offering a window of time to attempt a crossing. He ordered his Spirit to be moved from Curtis Field to Roosevelt Field, shown here. He left the care of the plane in the hands of his ground crew, who attended to the final phase of fueling, and then returned to his hotel room in the hopes of getting a little rest. As fate would have it, because of interruptions, he got less than 3 hours of sleep that night. On May 20, Lindbergh returned to Roosevelt Field, shown here, a little before 3 in the morning. A light drizzle hung in the air, but the weather reports promised clearer weather by daybreak. Fueling the plane took most of the night. It was a long process because the fuel had to be filtered through cheesecloth to remove any impurities. A little past 7 in the morning, Lindbergh suited up and climbed into his wicker seat, pulled down his goggles, and at about 7:40 a.m. on May 20, 1927, the plane started up. With the yank on the ropes holding the wheel chocks in place, he advanced the throttle and began his takeoff roll. The time was 7:52 a.m. The plane moved slowly at first, then gathered momentum. For Lindbergh, as he later reported, quote, "The spirit of St. Louis felt like an overloaded truck at first," unquote. But gradually the controls stiffened at the halfway point past. It bounced twice, as if to protest leaving the ground, but finally rose in triumph and cleared by 20 feet the telephone wires at the end of the field. The spirit was quickly lost in the mist as it moved into history, as shown in this famous painting. What most spectators remarked on afterward was the silence. As the plane took to the sky, there was no cheering, just an uneasy quiet as how close Lindbergh had come to those wires, and how alone he now was in that small, fabric-covered plane. Through most of that first day, Lindbergh's progress could be followed fairly closely. As he sailed over Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, reports came in more or less constantly, confirming his position and that he seemed to be doing fine. By hour 5, around 12 noon, New York time, he was over Nova Scotia. Here's an example of how Lindbergh recorded his progress from his instrument readings to his log sheet at the completion of each hour of his flight. From this information, he was able to make changes in his flight direction as needed. Shortly after hour 11, about 6 p.m., he passed over the last rocky extremity of North America at Newfoundland and headed out over the Atlantic Ocean. Now he would be out of touch for 16 hours if all went well, forever if it didn't. Darkness set in about hour 14, around 8:15 New York time, and a thin low fog formed over the sea, through which the white icebergs below showed up with surprising clearness. The fog became thicker and increased in height until within 2 hours he was just skimming the top of storm clouds at about 10,000 feet. The tops of some of the storm clouds were several thousand feet above him. And at one time, when he attempted to fly through one of the larger clouds, sleet and ice started to collect on his plane, and he was forced to turn around and get back into clear air immediately, and then fly around any clouds he could not get over. He continued on course at times skimming only 10 feet above the waves as he tried to find a way around the fog and maintain his course. Pressing on, he marked his 15th hour in flight. The time was 9:53 p.m. And to his delight, the icing began to dissipate slowly, ending what could have been a fatal encounter with the weather. Sleep, or the compelling urge to close his eyes and rest, oppressed Lindbergh throughout the flight. There comes a point when the body's demand for sleep is harder to endure than any pain, when it results in a state of semi-consciousness. And during the dark hours of the night, he tried to stay alert by bouncing on the seat and by stamping his feet until they ached. But after 3 hours of darkness, he felt so drowsy that he began using his thumbs to prop his eyelids open. At dawn, which appeared at hour 20, around 3 a.m. New York time, over the mid-Atlantic, Lindbergh finally escaped the grip of foul weather and drowsiness. He had been flying for over 20 hours and had hardly slept for over 2 days. During the 22nd hour of the flight at about 5 a.m. New York time, his extreme physical fatigue set the stage for one of the most peculiar episodes of the entire flight: his encounter with phantoms. In his autobiography, a copy of which also is over to my right on the resource table, Lindbergh told of phantoms appearing in the rear of the fuselage while he was flying through the fog. These transparent and mist-like creatures were visible, although his eyes were focused straight ahead. Human-like, they appeared to move effortlessly through the cabin, passing in and out of the fabric walls of the fuselage. More remarkable, one or more would actually linger to talk to the fatigued pilot and rejoin the group of phantoms in the rear of the fuselage. Lindbergh acknowledged that, quote, this experience could be easily dismissed as the hallucinations of a tired pilot, the ravings of a sleepless brain, unquote. Hours passed as he continued his relentless passage across the vast ocean, changing his altitude whenever he deemed it necessary to exploit the most favorable flying condition. At about the 28th hour, 10:52 New York time, he observes a coastline in the distance. Referring to his chart, sitting on his lap, he identifies the land to be Dingle Bay at the southern tip of Ireland. The Spirit is less than 3 miles from Lindbergh's estimated landfall and nearly 2 hours ahead of his schedule. A truly remarkable feat of piloting. While flying over southern Ireland and then southern England at an altitude of about 1,500 feet, Lindbergh did not feel even slightly sleepy. His interest in the landscape beneath his wings kept him alert. The sun was setting when the Spirit crossed the English Channel and flew over the port of Cherbourg, France. And despite the gathering darkness, he felt wide awake, full of excitement. At the mouth of the Seine River, he celebrated by reaching for food for the first time since he sat back in the hangar at Curtis Field. He held the control stick with his knees and reached under his wicker chair for the paper bag, from which he pulled one of his 5 wrapped sandwiches. He stuffed the wrapping back into the bag, not wanting the litter from a sandwich to symbolize his first contact with Paris, France. As Lindbergh covered the last 200 miles from Cherbourg to Paris, he had no idea that he was about to experience fame on a scale and intensity unlike any experienced by any human before. It never occurred to him that many people would be waiting for him. He wondered if anyone at the airfield would speak English, and if he would be in trouble for not having a French visa. His plan was first to see to it that his plane was stowed securely, and second, to cable his mother to give her the news he had arrived safely. He supposed that there would be 1 or 2 press interviews, maybe, assuming reporters worked that late in France, and then he would have to find a hotel someplace, and at some point He would also need to buy clothes and personal items because he hadn't packed anything at all, not even a toothbrush. He followed the navigation beacons down the Seine River on his night approach to Paris from the west, then circled the Eiffel Tower and headed northeast for about 7 miles to Le Bourget Airfield, where he landed. Over an estimated 100,000 people greeted him at 10:22 p.m. Paris time, 5:22 p.m. New York time, on the night of May 21, 1927. Elapsed time precisely 33 hours, 30 minutes, and 29 seconds after taking to the air. According to an official barograph that the National Aeronautic Association of America had bolted into his plane just before departure. The barograph marked his time and altitude on a slowly revolving cylinder of paper, showing his nonstop flight covered 3,610 miles. He had won the Orteig Prize. Charles Lindbergh found himself enveloped by thousands of frenzied people. His night passage out of the heavens to the earth, in the words of one biographer, evoked, quote, demonstrations of emotion appropriate to the coming of some long-awaited God, unquote. Alone and against improbable odds, he had traversed a vast ocean, earning mythic stature in the minds of his contemporaries, and his silver monoplane illuminated in the floodlights of Le Bourget appeared as a ghostly harbinger of a new technological future. And at that moment, Charles Lindbergh became the most famous and recognized person in the world. One might ask, what was it about Charles Lindbergh and his 1927 flight to Paris that so transfixed the world? In good measure, it clearly was Lindbergh himself. The fact that he was young and wholesome, and that he did it alone, and that he behaved with such modesty and confidence in the immediate aftermath of the flight. To this could be added the pure enhancement of knowing that an ocean could now be crossed. All that can be said is that for some unknowable reason, Lindbergh's flight brought the world a moment of sublime, spontaneous, unifying joy on a scale never before seen. Charles Lindbergh would forevermore be the touchstone for that feeling. On May 13, 1928, Lindbergh donated the Spirit of St. Louis to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., to become part of its aeronautical collection, after he had logged 489 hours in 174 flights in its one-year flight history. Here's a picture of the Spirit on display in the National Air and Space Museum today in Washington. And for your information, a full-size replica of the Spirit of St. Louis, pictured here, flying above the city of Paris, made out of Lego blocks below, is the centerpiece of the EAA AirVenture Museum Lindbergh exhibit in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. It was built in 1977 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Lindbergh's flight across the Atlantic Ocean and subsequent tour of the 48 United States during that summer, touching down in all 48 states in 1927 and in 1977. In 1987, this replica plane was removed from the EAA Museum and shipped to Paris, France, then reassembled and flown into Le Bourget Airport to commemorate the 60th anniversary of Lindbergh's flight. Historically, one of the first persons to greet Charles Lindbergh upon his landing at Le Bourget in 1927 was Fernand Sarrazin, pictured here, chief mechanic at the airfield. 60 years later, on May 21, 1987, Mr. Sarrazin was also the first person to greet EAA pilot Vern Jobst, pictured here in this slide, when he reenacted this historic moment at Le Bourget. And in closing, here's the last known photograph of Charles Lindbergh, taken just before he died on August 26, 1974, at the age of 72 in Maui, in the Hawaiian Islands. His burial site, very simple burial site, is pictured here, highlighted by a verse from Psalm 139, verse 9. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. And it just had his birth date and death date on there, C-A-L. And now you know the rest of the story, and I thank you for your interest in this great moment in history. Thank you.